You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of like total precision.
Right, yeah.
If you take a bad fall in the ice and your arm swells up, you go to the hospital, and the process is incredibly straightforward. I mean, they put you in front of an x-ray machine, the image pops up on a screen, and the doctor just points to a jagged white line on the bone.
Right there on the radius.
Yeah, there it is. The problem is totally visible, it is measurable, and the solution is prescribed with absolute certainty. 6 weeks in a cast, and you are good to go.
It is binary. I
Right.
mean, the bone is either broken or it is not broken. And we find a lot of comfort in that kind of clarity, you
Yep.
know. As humans, we want our problems to be physical, visible, and just easily categorized into a neat little box.
Oh, absolutely. But then you step into the world of the human soul, you step into spiritual realities, and suddenly that pristine x-ray machine is completely useless.
Totally useless.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. We have these seasons where we feel like totally trapped by our own destructive habits, or we feel cornered by cynics at our workplace, and this is a big one. We are absolutely terrified of losing our voice for the truth when the pressure is on.
Yeah, that fear of freezing up.
Right. And for those internal struggles, there is no simple physical cure. You cannot put a plaster cast on a wounded conscience. So, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Our mission for this deep dive is to examine a highly specific section of Scripture today.
Yes, verses 41 through 48 of Psalm 119.
We are pulling heavily from Charles Spurgeon's massive commentary, The Treasury of David, and we will be looking at insights from various Puritan and Reformed commentators, guys like Thomas Manton, William Cowper, and Samuel Rutherford.
Some of the best minds we have.
For sure. So if you have ever felt like you are losing the battle against your own hesitations, these 8 verses offer a masterclass in how God's grace creates unparalleled boldness.
What is fascinating right out of the gate is the structural genius of the text itself. Like, we were looking at the vow section of the psalm.
Let's give a bit of context for that, for those who might not know.
Right, so Psalm 119 is an acrostic poem in Hebrew. That means each section corresponds to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet moving sequentially. So vow is the 6th letter. But here's the brilliant linguistic catch.
I love this part.
In the Hebrew language, almost no standalone words begin with the letter vow. It is actually a conjunction.
Meaning and or so, right.
Precisely. That means every single verse we are about to discuss begins with a connecting word. It establishes a massive, unbroken chain reaction of grace and obedience. I mean, nothing in this text happens in isolation.
Everything is linked to the thing that came right before it.
Yes, always connected.
Okay, let us break down this chain reaction, starting with the very first link, which is verse 41. The verse pleads, let thy mercies come also unto me, O Lord, even thy salvation. Now, what jumps out immediately is the plural nature of the word mercies.
Oh yeah, that is key.
The writer does not ask for a single drop of mercy, He asks for plural mercies. And he adds this very specific, almost desperate plea for even me. When I read this, I picture like a major medical crisis.
Going back to the hospital analogy.
Right. Think about a patient rushed into the emergency room after a catastrophic car crash. That patient does not just need a single doctor. They need a massive coordinated trauma team.
They need everyone on deck.
Yeah, they need the trauma surgeon to stop the internal bleeding, and they need the anesthesiologist to manage the pain. They need the orthopedic specialist to reset the shattered bones, and they need the respiratory therapist to keep oxygen flowing.
And if they only get one of those interventions.
They still die. Salvation feels very much like that. It is a multidisciplinary rescue operation for the soul. But I want to push back on the text just a little bit here for the sake of argument.
Sure, go ahead.
Why ask for plural mercies instead of just one giant act of salvation? Is salvation not a single comprehensive event where God simply declares you forgiven?
Well, if we look at this through the lens of Reformed theology, we see why the plural is absolutely necessary, and why your trauma team analogy is spot on. Spurgeon notes that the writer is guilty as well as ignorant.
Meaning we don't even know how bad off we are.
Right. That is a direct nod to our total inability apart from divine intervention. Salvation, in the Reformed understanding, is not just a single historical event where God stamps your passport to heaven and just, leaves you to figure out the rest.
It's way more involved than that.
It is a massive aggregate of mercies. It aligns perfectly with what theologians call the Ordo Salutis, the logical sequence of salvation.
Okay, let us unpack those steps for the listener, because theological terms can sometimes sound like dry textbook material, but they actually describe an intensely dramatic rescue.
Oh, absolutely. So you need calling mercy to even wake you up from your spiritual coma.
Calling mercy is like the alarm clock going off in a burning building. You would sleep right through the fire if God did not sound the alarm in your ears.
That is a great way to put it. And then you need regenerating mercy to give you an entirely new heart.
Which is the Ezekiel 36 promise, right? Taking out the heart of stone and putting in a heart of flesh. It is a literal spiritual transplant.
Yeah. And then you need justifying mercy to declare you righteous in the courtroom of heaven. You need adopting mercy to bring you into the family, and you need sanctifying mercy for your daily failures. The psalmist understands that he requires a multitude of divine actions to secure his soul.
When you realize how many distinct things have to happen to save a person, the plea, even me, becomes incredibly poignant. I mean, it is intensely personal.
It really is the cry of a person who recognizes their absolute bankruptcy.
It makes me think of Elizabeth Codner's hymn from 1860, Even Me. The imagery in that hymn is of a parched, thirsty patch of land receiving showers of blessing. The singer is watching others receive this life-giving rain.
Right. She is seeing God move elsewhere.
Yeah, she is watching revivals happen in other towns. She is watching grace flood into other families, and she is begging, let some droppings fall on me, even me. There is a real desperation there.
You are watching the trauma team of grace rush into the hospital room next door, and you are crying out from your own bed, do not bypass my room, I need the same intervention.
Yes. And that desperation is driven by a right understanding of who we are and who God is. We are entirely dependent on him initiating that contact.
And William Cowper makes a brilliant distinction here about the motivation behind seeking these mercies. He points out that wicked men take from God without pledging any return.
Oh, wow. That is a sharp observation.
It is. They want the rain so their crops will grow and make them wealthy. They want the physical healing so they can go back to indulging their flesh. But they have zero intention of honoring the giver of those gifts.
So they just want the benefits, not the relationship.
Spot on. The godly, however, seek blessings specifically so they can glorify the giver. They want the mercy, so their mouths will be open to sing, and their hands will be strengthened to work for the kingdom.
So what does this mean for the person listening to us right now? It means that when you asked for God's help on a Tuesday morning, you are not asking for a temporary painkiller to make your life a little more comfortable. You are asking for a multifaceted, sweeping intervention so that you can actually function as you were originally designed to function.
Which is to glorify God.
Right. And that brings us to the logical result of receiving those mercies, which is the next link in the vow chain of verse 42. Receiving this multifaceted mercy equips the believer for external conflict. The verse says, so shall I have wherewith to answer him that reproacheth me, for I trust in thy word.
The chain reaction continues.
But here's where I get tripped up, and I think a lot of modern Christians do too. Are we not taught that faith is the evidence of things not seen? Why do we need ammunition or an answer for scoffers?
You mean, shouldn't we just ignore them?
Yeah. Should we not just keep our heads down and look toward heaven? Why engage with the reproach at all?
That is a very common misconception about how we engage with a skeptical world. We are not called to a blind, irrational leap into the dark, ignoring all opposition. The text clearly says, for I trust in thy word.
So it's an active, engaged trust?
Yes, the expert commentators call this the logic of facts. When God grants actual, tangible deliverance, when those plural mercies actually show up in your daily reality, it provides an unanswerable rebuttal to the skeptic.
Because it's not just a theory anymore.
Absolutely. Abstract arguments can be debated all day long in the university classroom. A skilled philosopher can poke holes in a logical syllogism. But a lived experience of God's faithfulness shuts down reproach completely. The changed life, the sustained spirit under immense trial, the actual historical deliverance, these are concrete facts.
You can debate a syllogism, but you cannot argue with a resurrected life. If someone knew you when you were an absolute wreck, enslaved to anger or addiction, and now they see a person full of peace and self-control, I mean, they can mock your theology, but they cannot mock the result.
Because the result is sitting right in front of them.
Right. Hugo Cardinalis categorized 3 distinct types of blasphemers or critics that believers face, didn't he?
He did, and he paired them with the specific answers they require. He said there are devils, heretics, and slanderers.
Okay, let's break this down.
So devils are answered by the internal word of humility. You cannot outpride Satan. He fell because of pride. You defeat his accusations by humbly agreeing with your need for grace.
Wow, that is really insightful. What about heretics?
Heretics, who actively twist the truth, are answered by the external word of wisdom by knowing the scriptures thoroughly and correcting the error. But slanderers, The human critics who mock your faith at the office or at a family gathering, they are answered by the active word of a good life.
Let us unpack the psychology of that for a second. Slanderers are answered by the active word of a good life. How does that actually work in practice?
It worked through cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. When a slanderer mocks you, they're trying to attach a negative label to you, right? Like hypocrite, fool, bigot. But if your daily conduct, fueled by those plural mercies we just talked about, is full of unimpeachable integrity, kindness, and patience, the label refuses to stick.
It just slides right off.
The slander falls flat because the evidence of your life contradicts the accusation. Albert Barnes noted something similar when he pointed out that Jesus answered the tempter in the wilderness, utilizing the exact words of Scripture.
Yes. Christ did not use his divine might to blast Satan into oblivion in that moment.
Which he totally could have done.
He could have, but he used the written text, demonstrating perfect, lived-out reliance on the Father. He modeled the lived experience of trusting the Word under pressure.
And we must recognize the intense vulnerability here, because the obvious counter-question is, well, what happens when that defense fails? What happens when the believer loses the ability to speak those facts?
That is a very dark place to be.
The transition into verse 43 exposes a terrifying possibility for the Christian. The psalmist prays, "Take not the word of truth utterly out of my mouth, for I have hoped in thy judgments."
Losing your voice?
Right. I read that and immediately thought of a defense attorney standing in front of a jury in a high-stakes murder trial. The attorney steps up to the podium, opens his mouth to deliver the closing argument that will exonerate his client, and suddenly his mind goes completely blank.
Oh, that is a nightmare scenario.
He forgets the case law, he forgets the forensic evidence, he stammers, looks at his notes, and realizes he cannot read the words. He's rendered completely mute while his client's life hangs in the balance. That is the agony of the mute believer.
Charles Bridges writes extensively about this condition, noting how indulging in worldly habits causes a massive loss of liberty in speech.
Bridges hits the nail on the head regarding the mechanics of shame. Think about the modern equivalent. Have you ever been sitting in a break room at work and the conversation turns toward mocking Christianity or tearing down biblical morality?
I think we have all been there.
You know the apologetics, you have read the books, you know what to say to defend the truth, but your throat tightens up, your heart races, and you stay completely silent.
And why is that?
Not because you lack the intellectual answer, but because you know that an hour earlier you were participating in the exact same toxic office gossip as everyone else. Your own hypocrisy creates cognitive dissonance, and you become too ashamed of your own conduct to speak for God.
The word of truth is taken out of your mouth by your own compromise. That is the paralyzing effect of a wounded conscience.
It is brutal.
The psychological and spiritual causes of this silence are vast and devastating. It could be open, unconfessed sin, as you just described, which breeds intense shame. But it could also be severe depression, where the believer feels completely abandoned by God and the theological words they used to sing turn to ash in their mouth.
Yeah, that is a very real, very painful reality for a lot of people.
Or, from a strictly Reformed perspective, it could be a form of severe spiritual discipline from God. Notice the verse mentions hoping in God's judgments.
Right. Judgments aren't always just final condemnation.
Absolutely not. Trusting in God's judgments means trusting his righteous governance of the entire world, whether that involves fulfilling sweet promises to believers or executing harsh discipline. Sometimes God deliberately withdraws the sense of his presence to discipline us, to make us realize how desperately we rely on him to fill our mouths with truth.
That brings up a heartbreaking quote from Samuel Rutherford.
Rutherford, his letters are incredible.
They really are. He was a brilliant 17th century Scottish minister, a delegate to the Westminster Assembly, and a man who lived to preach the gospel. But because of his convictions, he was exiled to the city of Aberdeen and legally forbidden from preaching. He was confined, silenced by the state.
Stripped of his calling, essentially.
Yeah. He lamented his situation in his letters, saying, "I am a dry tree." He went on to say that his desire to worship and honor God was sick of jealousy. He considered preaching his one true joy outside of heaven itself.
To have the word of truth taken out of his mouth by human authorities, and to feel the silence stretching on for months and years, that was absolute psychological agony for him.
He felt like a finely tuned instrument locked in a dusty case.
Rutherford's agony proves how intensely he treasured the word. He was not a hired hand clocking in to do a job. He was a herald who felt the fire of the truth in his bones. For the believer who truly understands grace, being silenced whether by personal sin, depression, or external force, is worse than being physically restrained.
You want to avoid becoming that barren, dry tree at all costs. But how? To avoid that barrenness, the believer requires a supernatural sustaining grace to persist through the silence and the failure.
Which connects directly to verse 44. The psalmist declares an incredible resolution. So shall I keep thy law continually forever and ever.
Okay, here is where I have to pause and ask a very cynical human question.
I figured you might.
Continually, forever and ever. Are we supposed to take this massive stacked hyperbole literally? I mean, in a single breath, the writer uses 3 distinct phrases that all mean without end.
It is a lot.
Knowing human nature, knowing our propensity to fail at keeping a simple diet for more than 48 hours, how can anyone make a claim of eternal continuous obedience with a straight face? It sounds like arrogant boasting.
It sounds like boasting until you understand the engine driving the claim. Thomas Manton's analysis is incredibly helpful here. He says the heaping up of these specific words demonstrates 2 distinct realities.
Okay, what is the first one?
First, it acknowledges the extreme difficulty of perseverance. It requires constant, unrelenting vigilance. The writer knows he cannot just coast on yesterday's grace. He must actively, aggressively pursue obedience continually.
So the repetition is almost like him bracing himself for the long haul.
Yes. And second, it shows the vehemence of the writer's affection. When you are deeply emotionally moved, you repeat yourself. You stack adjectives. You exhaust your vocabulary trying to express the magnitude of your intention.
That makes total sense.
But linking this back to the Westminster Confession, we have to look at the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints to understand how this is even possible.
Let us do an ELI 5 explain con. Like, I'm 5 on the perseverance of the saints because it is a highly misunderstood concept. A lot of people think it just means that saints are incredibly stubborn people who white-knuckle their way to heaven.
It is the exact opposite of that. The doctrine states that those whom God has accepted and his beloved effectually called and sanctified by his Spirit can neither totally nor finally fall away from the state of grace.
Right. They shall certainly persevere therein to the end and be eternally saved.
Yes. This perpetual obedience the psalmist is aiming for is not generated by human willpower. It is guaranteed by grace alone. God's sustaining grip on the believer is what guarantees that the believer will keep coming back to the law, repenting when they fail, weeping over their sin, and striving forward continually.
So it is not about flawless performance.
No, it is about an unbreakable tether.
It is God holding you, not you holding God. When you recognize that reality, the timeline of your gratitude expands to infinity. It makes me think of Joseph Addison's famous hymn verse. He wrote, "Eternity's too short to utter all thy praise."
Beautiful lines.
When you realize that the plural mercies from verse 41 are going to sustain you past your own inevitable failures, the hyperbole of verse 44 becomes the only logical response. You literally run out of earthly time to say thank you.
Chrysostom adds another layer to this, looking forward to the eschaton. He notes that this repetition points beyond our current life to the next. Well, in this life, our obedience is fractured. We are battling the flesh, the surrounding culture, and the adversary. But Chrysostom says this, forever and ever anticipates the glorified state. In heaven, believers will experience pure, exact keeping of the law without any fear of sinning.
The internal war of Romans 7 will be over.
Yes. We will finally be able to execute the desires of our renewed hearts without the frustrating interference of our fallen nature.
That is a staggering comfort. The desire you have right now to live perfectly for God, a desire that constantly gets thwarted by your own weakness and fatigue, will one day be fully realized. Your performance will finally match your preference.
But, for a lot of people, the idea of keeping a law forever sounds like an eternal prison sentence.
Oh, absolutely. If we are brutally honest, we often view laws as restrictions on our joy.
Yet, the very next verse flips that modern assumption entirely on its head. Verse 45 says, "And I will walk at liberty, for I seek thy precepts."
This is the great paradox of the Christian faith. The secular world views freedom as the absolute absence of all constraints. Autonomy is the highest cultural value. Nobody tells me what to do. But the psalmist links wide-open liberty directly to seeking precepts, rules, statutes, commands.
It is counterintuitive, isn't it?
It really is. I love updating analogies for this because it is so difficult for the modern mind to grasp. Think about the operating system on a smartphone.
Okay. I like where this is going.
A smartphone is an incredible piece of technology capable of connecting you to the entire globe, taking brilliant photos, and managing your life. But it can only do those things if it operates strictly within the coded parameters of its operating system.
Right, the code dictates everything.
If you decide that the phone is too restricted by its code, and you jailbreak it and delete the core operating system to give it total freedom, you do not get a superphone with infinite possibilities. You get a glass and metal paperweight. It is entirely useless.
That is a brilliant way to picture it.
Or think about learning a language. You are only free to write beautiful, sweeping poetry in French if you rigorously submit yourself to the strict rules of French grammar and vocabulary. True freedom is operating within the design parameters set by your creator.
F.W. Robertson unpacks the spiritual mechanics of this true freedom really well. He says that being free from the law does not mean a believer can sin without consequence or live chaotically. Rather, it means God's Spirit writes the law on our hearts through love rather than fear.
So the motivation changes.
Entirely. When you are under the law without grace, the law is an external terror. It is a harsh, unyielding taskmaster standing over you with a whip. You obey because you are terrified of the punishment. But when grace enters the equation, the core motivation shifts. You obey because you genuinely love the lawgiver.
The consciousness of restraint is removed. You are doing what you want to do.
Thomas Watson has a fantastic analogy for this. He pictures a man locked in a damp, dark prison cell. He is guilty, he is bound in heavy iron chains, and he's waiting for the executioner's footfalls in the hallway.
Just a completely hopeless situation.
Right. So how does he know he has been pardoned? He does not just get a certificate slid under the door while he stays in chains. He knows he is pardoned when the jailer comes in, knocks the heavy iron fetters off his wrists, opens the massive steel door, and lets him walk out into the bright sunlight.
The physical reality changes.
Yes. Watson says if the fetters of sin are broken off and we walk at liberty in the ways of God, this is a blessed sign we are pardoned. The actual lived ability to walk away from the sin that used to enslave you is the tangible proof of your emancipation.
And we can add John Stevens' imagery to this to capture the emotional reality. He likens the believer's journey to a traveler moving through a terrifying, narrow mountain pass. The rock walls are closing in, boulders are falling, the path is icy and treacherous, and one wrong step means falling into the abyss.
Sounds highly stressful.
It is. But then suddenly, the traveler emerges from the dark gorge into a vast, sunlit, spacious valley. He is secure. He can finally take a deep breath. That is the massive expansion of mind a person experiences when they realize they are justified by faith.
The crushing claustrophobia of legalism is gone.
The suffocating weight of trying to earn your own salvation is lifted. They walk at liberty in the valley of grace.
So what does this all mean for the believer's interaction with the hostile world around them? When a person experiences this vast, spacious liberty, they lose their fear of human authority.
Because when the ultimate judge of the universe has knocked the fetters off your wrists and declared you righteous, you stop trembling in front of earthly magistrates who can only harm the body.
Which transitions us beautifully to the next link in the chain, verse 46. I will speak of thy testimonies also before kings and will not be ashamed.
This is the logical progression of the vow, the continuous and I will walk at liberty, and I will speak before kings. True, internal liberty eradicates external cowardice.
It does.
But wait, how does someone go from hiding from scoffers in the break room, which we talked about back in verse 42, to boldly lecturing monarchs? I mean, that is a massive, almost unbelievable leap in confidence. Most of us get nervous speaking up in a basic staff meeting, let alone standing before a head of state with the power to ruin our lives.
The difference is the sudden, crystal-clear realization of who actually holds sovereignty. Matthew Henry makes an insightful observation here regarding the nature of earthly kings.
What does he say?
He notes that kings are sometimes judges, like Saul was to David when David was running for his life in the wilderness. And sometimes they are peers, as other monarchs were when David finally took the throne. When David was a fugitive, his life was entirely in Saul's hands, humanly speaking.
Right.
But believers must never sacrifice their religion to statecraft, political expediency, or polite company. Whether you are standing before a hostile king who holds the power of life and death over you, or you are at a banquet with powerful cultural influencers who could ruin your career, the mandate remains exactly the same. Speak the testimonies of God without shame.
Thomas LeBlanc actually outlines 4 specific vices that believers must actively shun in these high-stakes pressure cooker situations.
Oh, these are so practical.
First, overmuch silence. We cannot just quietly smile, nod, and look at our shoes when the truth is being dismantled in front of us.
Right.
Second, useless talkativeness. We are not called to be obnoxious, argumentative contrarians who debate trivial things just to hear our own voices. We are called specifically to speak of God's testimonies.
It's about speaking the right words, not just making noise.
Third, cowardice. The fear of man brings a snare, causing us to retreat when we should stand firm. And fourth, cowardly bashfulness.
What does he mean by that?
That is that false humility where we say, oh, who am I to speak up? I am not a theologian. I am not articulate. When you are representing the King of Kings, bashfulness is actually a direct insult to your sender. It implies he did not equip you for the room he placed you in.
Wow. And church history provides us with thrilling, blood-pumping examples of this specific verse in action. The Puritan writer Thomas Brooks loved to catalog these historical moments of defiance to encourage believers.
Yes. Let us talk about Martin Luther standing at the Diet of Worms in 1521. This was not a polite theological debate. He was a single, relatively obscure monk standing against the combined, terrifying might of the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy.
The weight of the world was on him.
The emperor, the princes, the bishops, they were all gathered, and they pointed to a stack of Luther's books on a table. They demanded he recant his writings or face the fire. And Luther famously declared that his conscience was captive to the word of God.
He supposedly said he would go to Worms even if there were as many devils in the city as there were tiles on the roofs.
He stood there, facing the most powerful men on earth, and said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." That is verse 46, leaping off the page and altering human history.
Brooks also points to Hugh Latimer, the English reformer. Latimer was known for his blunt boldness, and he once handed King Henry VIII a New Year's gift. Now, we have to set the stage here. King Henry VIII was not a man you wanted to cross, even on a good day.
Oh, absolutely not.
He was notoriously brutal, erratic, and possessed absolute unquestioned authority over the church and state in England. This is a man who beheaded 2 of his own wives when they displeased him.
Just walking into his presence would make a normal person's blood run cold.
Exactly. I mean, totally. Yet Latimer handed him a New Testament wrapped in a napkin, and on the outside of that napkin, Latimer had conspicuously inscribed a motto warning the king directly against the sin of adultery.
That is breathtaking, almost incomprehensible courage. To physically step forward and hand a written warning about adultery to Henry VIII requires a level of liberty that is entirely supernatural.
It really does.
Latimer was walking in that spacious, sunlit valley we talked about earlier. He feared the judgment of God so much that he had absolutely zero fear left over for the King of England. He knew the worst Henry could do was kill him, which would only send him to the God he loved.
But we have to ask the critical question. What actually fuels this kind of death-defying boldness? It is not mere duty. A sense of duty will evaporate the moment the executioner starts sharpening his axe.
So true.
It is not natural stubbornness either. Stubbornness melts under the threat of prolonged torture or social ruin. The only fuel that burns hot enough to sustain that kind of courage is intense, burning affection. You only risk everything for something you love supremely.
And that takes us to the climax of this entire section, verses 47 and 48. The text reads, "And I will delight myself in thy commandments, which I have loved. My hands also will I lift up unto thy commandments, which I have loved, and I will meditate in thy statutes."
The psychological progression here is beautiful. He starts with delighting, moves to a settled loving, then moves to physical action-lifting hands, and finally settles into deep, sustained meditation.
I picture the physical action of lifting hands like a toddler.
How do you mean?
When a father walks in the front door after a long trip holding a gift, or even just offering an embrace, the toddler does not just sit on the couch and intellectually appreciate the father's presence. The child's arms shoot straight up in the air.
It is an immediate full-body reaction.
Yes. They are reaching up for something they desperately want to hold. It's an involuntary reflex to something beautiful.
That is a perfect illustration of what Stephen Charnock calls the law of love. Charnock, another theological heavyweight from the Puritan era, contrasts the believer's internal experience with the unbeliever's.
Okay, let's look at that contrast.
Before a person receives the plural mercies we discussed in verse 41, the law of God is a dead letter. In fact, Charnock uses intense language, saying it is a devilish letter to the carnal mind.
Meaning they hate it.
Absolutely. The unredeemed person wishes the moral law of God were completely erased from the universe because it constantly condemns them and restricts their flesh. They only obey the visible portions of it out of sheer terror of punishment.
It is like a reckless driver who only taps the brakes because he spots a police cruiser hiding behind a billboard on the highway. He does not love the speed limit. He hates the speed limit.
He just hates the financial penalty of a traffic ticket more.
Right. The moment the cruiser is out of sight, he slams the accelerator back down.
That's it perfectly. The compliance is entirely external and forced. But after grace intervenes, the law becomes a beloved internal reality. The Holy Spirit writes it directly on the heart.
So the law itself doesn't change, the heart does.
Yes, the believer now views the law not as a restrictive cage, but as a beautiful portrait of the God they adore. And notice the holistic nature of this devotion in the text. The mind is fully engaged in meditating, the heart is fully engaged in loving and delighting, and the hands are physically engaged in lifting.
It involves the intellect, the affections, and the will. No part of the human person is left out of this worship.
Henry Hammond actually breaks down the phrase lifting hands into 4 distinct meanings, all of which apply beautifully to the Christian life.
Let's hear them.
First, it means praying for grace to act. You are lifting empty hands to heaven, acknowledging your weakness and asking God to fill them with the strength to obey.
Like the toddler reaching up.
Second, it means blessing God for advantages received. Hands lifted in praise, acknowledging that every good thing, every answered prayer comes directly from Him. Third, swearing an oath of obedience. Think of raising your right hand in a courtroom to swear to tell the truth. The believer pledges allegiance to God's statutes.
And the fourth.
And fourth, actively undertaking a task. Rolling up your sleeves, listing your hands to do the hard, gritty work of living out the faith in a fallen, broken world.
And this brings us to a fascinating historical contrast that highlights the superiority of the gospel. The secular philosophers of antiquity caught a tiny, blurry glimpse of this concept, though they lacked the grace to ever fully achieve it.
You're thinking of Aristotle, right?
Yeah, Aristotle was once asked what profit he had derived from a lifetime of studying philosophy. He answered, "I have learnt to do without constraint that which others do from fear of the law."
Aristippus, another Greek thinker, said something similar. If the laws were lost, all of us would live as we do now that they are in force.
They recognized, purely through human reason, that true virtue must act from internal character, not from external coercion. But here's where the gospel entirely surpasses human philosophy. Philosophy can train the mind to appreciate virtue. It can teach a person to act politely.
But it can't change the nature.
Right. Only the regenerating grace of the Holy Spirit can resurrect a spiritually dead heart to actually love the holy standards of God. If a pagan philosopher could find a measure of joy in strict moral discipline, how much more should the Christian, who knows the lawgiver personally as a loving Father, delight in His commands?
Christ Himself said, "If a man love me, he will keep my words." The obedience is not the prerequisite for the love. The obedience is the natural, inevitable overflow of the affection.
That is the complete anatomy of faith laid out in these 8 verses. It begins with acknowledging our total inability and pleading for God's plural mercies. It moves to experiencing the unanswerable logic of facts as God visibly delivers us.
It groans in agony when our own sin silences our testimony.
It relies entirely on God's preserving grace for eternal obedience.
It discovers that this rigorous obedience is actually the truest form of liberty.
It speaks this truth boldly before the highest, most intimidating human authorities. And it sustains all of this activity through a white-hot, holistic love for the Word of God.
It really is a massive progression.
So we bring this massive theological discussion directly to your daily reality, to you listening right now in your car or at your desk or while doing the dishes. We have covered a vast amount of ground, from the intricate steps of the Ordo Salutis to Martin Luther staring down the emperor at the Diet of Worms, but it all lands right in your lap today.
It all comes down to application.
Are you reaching out to God's precepts with your head, your heart, and your hands? Do you view biblical obedience as a heavy iron chain dragging you down into misery? Or do you see it as the wide-open, sunlit space of true liberty?
Such an important distinction.
When you face the scoffers in your own life, whether it is a cynical coworker at the water cooler, a skeptical family member at Thanksgiving dinner, or the accusing whispers of your own adversary in the middle of the night, Are you relying on your own clever arguments, or are you resting on the unanswerable logic of God's plural mercies at work in your lived experience?
And as you consider those deeply personal questions, I want to leave you with a final reflection to mull over, circling all the way back to the linguistic detail where we started.
The vow.
Yes. Recall that every single verse in this section begins with the Hebrew letter vau, meaning and or so. This implies that in the economy of God's grace, no action and no blessing ever stands alone in isolation.
Never alone.
Every single mercy you receive is a conjunction linking you to your next act of obedience, and every act of your obedience is a conjunction linking you to the next poured-out blessing. Your faith is an unbroken, divinely secured chain of ands. When God saves you, He does not just place a period at the end of your sentence and walk away. He places a vow. What is the next and in your life today?